It is no secret that Final Fantasy is my favorite video game franchise of all time. And with the title of this video being about Final Fantasy, you all expect me to go into glorious detail with it. Unfortunately, if I were to do that, these videos would be hours long, and I sadly do not have the time for that. It's no big deal though. When the time permits, I can follow up with a longer video considering the fact I really like talking about this subject. For the time being, I will attempt to give the Cliff Notes version of my history with Final Fantasy, and it is a long history, especially considering that Final Fantasy didn't become my favorite franchise for years. I do not recall which Final Fantasy I first set my eyes on, but Final Fantasy VIII was the first one I remember recurringly being exposed to by my older brother. Seeing the intro with Squall being cut around the face with blood trickling down, and Libertali Fatali playing around, opened my eyes to a lot of creativity in my toy life. It's kind of funny, but it's true. It is because of this game in .hack. I think it was .hack Outbreak or Infection. I think it was Infection. That I wanted to create my own RPG when I grew up. Obviously, that still hasn't happened, but it is still worth mentioning that the intro had quite the impression on me when I was young. Another point I always will bring up about this game is the soundtrack, because there was not one moment where I felt the music composition lacked or ruined anything in the story. Clearly, there was some great video game direction here. To go further with the soundtrack, I believe it still holds up together and currently listen to it to this day. The next thing to discuss was seeing the actual combat and graphics in the game. My older brother received or bought this game well after the PS2 came out, but I was not exposed to the graphical feats of that console yet, so I was always enamored with the CG cutscenes, the art, and the sprites. The combat looked trivial, like a trivial thing for me to accomplish, but that was besides the case because there is a learning curve when it comes to the junction system in this game. But to a kid who mainly played platformers and an occasional racing game, this looked like, a cakewalk, considering the fact I didn't know about the ATB system. The game somewhat used the ATB system. When I would sneakily get around to playing the game without my older brother's intervention, I would frequently acquire game over screens and was turned off from playing the game, further on in the future. I would often look up to my older brother and see him play this game, like it was simple. I always find it funny that my older brother would hide the game from me, but I'm sure he probably thought the game was too hard for me to play. Probably didn't want me to get frustrated either. Moving on, I was somewhat invested in the story, so I was always excited when he would move on, especially after grinding sessions, and would be somewhat sad when he moves on without me. That would all be remedied when I would see the notification to change disc or watching a memorable cutscene. I was a very simple kid, I guess, back then. I just wanted to see some more of that beautiful CG cutscenes. My older brother made it a mission to complete the game many times, so I always have the cutscene rent-free in my mind. And the cutscene I'm talking about is like the final cutscene in the game. It's like, I forgot how long it is, like 18 minutes long or something. It's quite a while. That and hearing the cutscenes made it feel like I don't mean the cutscenes, but the credits made it feel like the story had concluded. This game, in my opinion, has the finest soundtrack, and an underappreciated story and a noteworthy teenage protagonist has been through the thick of it. Stellar, but now it's time to get on to the next game. next game is Final Fantasy VII with Cloud and Friends, and obviously that's a fantastic game to watch. My older brother would play that, but standing next to Final Fantasy was quite difficult, especially at my young age. I'll get more into that in just a little bit, but Final Fantasy was not the best game to look at, these days. But back then it was not the worst thing in the world. It was actually quite impressive. Again, the music, was very exquisite. It's easily top 5 best soundtracks for me. The openings in the PS1 era Final Fantasy games were all memorable, and Final Fantasy VII is perhaps the most memorable of all of them. I loved 8's. I loved 9's, but 7 is easily the most recognizable. It's easily the most iconic as well out of the PS1 era ones games. I adore the opening and perhaps the theme, like the opening bomb mission. I think that's what it's called. It has the perfect amount of crescendo and urgency to keep players invested in the opening. Setting the mood is what Final Fantasy easily was great at. Having a somber tone and design that allowed the story to be more mature. That's not to say the game can't be silly, but I remember feeling a bit of despair in this one. The soundtrack was powerful at making the player feel that way. But, for me, right, as a kid, I cannot say that the game was attractive to me, but I still loved whenever my older brother would play, even if the content was rough for me. And I mean that for, virtually, I think, any game that he played, even if it was, Madden or if, a sports game. I don't mind watching him every now and then. It's one of those things that you bond over. So seeing him react to the game and then seeing, I'm reacting somewhat to the game, it was a great bonding moment. I can go on and on about the combat and story, but considering that this is perhaps one of the most accessible Final Fantasy games for newcomers and returning players, I don't think much else needs to be said. Aside from the graphics, the story, gameplay, and audio were fantastic in this game that most people have played, and for good reason. I am very appreciative that I got to experience the OG Final Fantasy VII before the remake was released, because it's just such an iconic and noteworthy game in the PS1 era. But now it's time to move on to the next game.
This may be our last chance.
Now I'm on to Final Fantasy X, the third one I was recurrently exposed to. I've been dying to talk about this game I mentioned in the video how I got into video games. That seeing my cousins, or just seeing the game Spider-Man on the PS1, got me into video games. Like, it kind of like pushed my door into the, like, I really wanted to try it, I guess. But seeing them play Final Fantasy X cemented the feeling that Final Fantasy was worth playing after all this time. And now it's kind of interesting for me to bring that up, but it's actually true. Like, uh, I liked Spider-Man, I liked platformers, I liked Crash Bandicoot, those were platforms. Spider-Man was like a platform, but Final Fantasy X was the first one I thought, well, I really want to play an RPG or a Final Fantasy game, and this was the one for me. This was the game I wanted to own for myself, despite my cousins and eventually my older brother owning it. I loved watching them play and learning how to, but once I had the game, I wanted to get lost and explore what Spirit had to offer. So, what I mean by that, obviously, it means exactly what it, like I said, like, I learn what I can, but eventually I want to do my own thing with it. I love Tidus, Yoon, and the rest of the Guardians and some of the other characters. It's not only looked, not only looked different, it also felt different. To Xanarkand, like the song really set the tone of the game. It was going to be quite a harrowing journey, like a harrowing journey for these characters. And just seeing that intro too, just back on the PS2, is still gorgeous, and it still is. I must admit that the story hit me differently when I was younger, because as a kid, it was more like, when you're a kid, it's more about accomplishing things and getting ahead and listening and acquiring accolades, just getting a lot of, like, a lot of praise and stuff. While as an adult, you look back and see how far you've come. So I essentially mean by that is, like, Final Fantasy X was more of like going on this journey and not really caring about any praise, just not caring about this destination, because the destination, or rather, when you see the intro, it's harrowing. It's, we're at our wits' end here. Like, like Tita says, like, there's not much time left. This is my story. There's not much time left. Like, it seems like it's very dire. And when you go on this journey, like, as you realize an adult, it's everything that you've come up to is just part of the journey. It's not the destination. So, I always felt like, you look at it differently. You look at this game differently. It seemed like a game more for adults to fully embrace and understand thoroughly. But that's not to say, like, teenagers and kids can't enjoy the game. They can enjoy aspects of this game, like the combat and the story and some of the characters and the designs. And saying all of this, right, I still haven't beaten this game to this day. I'm towards the end on my PS2 save file, but I have still not completed this game. Yet, saying that, I am aware how it ends and what happens to the world of Spirit. And while I did not cry or anything, it was very emotional. And that's not that's not in small part due to the music, the combat, voice acting, character designs, the characters, like the actual characters themselves. Everything here made it quite the complete package. I loved Blitzball. Obviously, I've done a playlist for Blitzball on my channel, so I really like Blitzball. Going back to character designs, was the first Final Fantasy game where I actually liked the designs of virtually everything in the game, from the locales, the characters, the creatures, like the magic spells, like some of the weapon designs. I mean, in other Final Fantasy games, you can see like the weapon designs, but seeing like how different each attack, it kind of sounds weird, but seeing how each person attacks, like whether it's like with a little like Moogle doll or something like that with Lulu, and Waka with his Blitzball, everyone had different designs, and I actually like that. I think something that a point of contention, like a very small point of contention, is probably the voice acting, but I like the charm that it presents in there, and obviously the music has aged very well. To this day, I love still playing this game, and will hopefully beat it someday soon. Saying that, we're moving on to the next game. The next game I'm going to be discussing is Final Fantasy X-2. This game was and remains interesting to me because this game looked like Final Fantasy X, but played completely different from it, and also changed a lot of elements that made the game a classic. I mean, in today's time, it's considered, like a classic. Back then, it was a modern classic, but, they made it seem like a very by-the-numbers kind of game. And so I'm not going to lie and say that I didn't find the female characters unattractive, when I was a prepubescent, but even then I wanted more from this one. It is the only Final Fantasy game that I had purchased and then returned or sold due to the fact I felt it was a waste of my time and money. The reasons are fairly simple. The story did not resonate with me, and the combat was par for the course, like I mentioned before, when it came to RPGs. At this time, I think I've seen enough RPGs, or maybe I played enough RPGs where I know that this game was like pretty much, as I said, par for the course, or by the numbers when it came to some of the combat. Like, I understand there's like dress spheres and stuff, and back then I didn't really care enough to dive more into it. It was a little bit different. Like, you can have, different abilities with different dress spheres and stuff, but I didn't really care about that stuff. I just wanted, I guess, more Final Fantasy X was offering, and obviously this game wasn't going to give that to me because it's different. So that's why I said I didn't find it too interesting at that time. I do not regret returning the game, though, because the game didn't speak to me then. I know a lot of people say, well, I wouldn't have, sold it or returned it, but I felt like it was a good thing for me to do back then. And the reason is because there was nothing compelling, nothing compelling to me or drawing me in other than the overture and the front cover. Like, the front cover was lovely. The overture, the theme that plays when you start up the game, is fantastic. But other than that, there's not really much that I can remember about this game. Like, to elaborate on that, like the other Final Fantasy games I've seen or played at this point had something I remember wanting to see or enjoy. So the opening bomb mission, I wanted to play that in Final Fantasy VII. Even if I didn't play Final Fantasy VII, I mean I did, but even if I didn't play Final Fantasy VII, that's something I can remember. With this game, there was a lot of very forgetful moments. Aside from a few moments here that made me giggle. However, that's pretty much it. And for a Final Fantasy game, that's pretty, bad. But in retrospect, this game is much better than what I thought it was, and I thank the people playing the HD remaster from videos I've seen on YouTube and live on PlayStation, because I came to understand this was kind of a divisive game due to several of the things I'd mentioned, and a little bit more things. And to, go on that a little bit more, like Final Fantasy VIII is a very divisive game as well. However, I saw my older brother really enjoy that game. Not a lot of people like the game, the junction system, the story, some of the combat. I mean, the music was pretty universally praised, but the combat and the story were not. So it's actually very interesting that I was off put by this game as well. So it's actually very interesting to understand and see why people like this game. It makes me want to play this game as well. And I obviously own the HD remaster of this game, so eventually I will go back to it. I would love to go back to it, but for right now, I think I'm all right. And then the last thing I can say about it is like the music for all Final Fantasy games is normally very, very good. This one's I guess no exception. However, I felt the music on this one was just fine. It's not what I go to, because when I go back to Final Fantasy music, I usually go for the whole soundtrack. This one is just like bits and pieces. I like some of the themes and the vocal tracks, but that's pretty much it for this one. Moving on to the last game I'm going to be discussing in this part.
Dream of the stars on high that speak secret sighs drifting on a breeze. Only I can feel and hear.
the last game I will be discussing this part is Final Fantasy Crystal Chronicles. And I have a love-hate with this game, and it mainly has to do with how the developers wanted to try some proprietary hardware on the GameCube, and might I add, quite the expensive one, considering you had to purchase at least 2 Game Boy Advances and cables connecting to the GameCube controller port. And that was not going to happen in my situation, so I was stuck playing this game solo, which to me sucked, because at this point in my life I loved playing games with my siblings, my future brother-in-law, and my older brother. It sucked that, Square Enix and Nintendo opted for something that not everyone was able to acquire, but, here we are. Before I continue further, I should mention that while I did purchase copies of Final Fantasy X and X-2, this was the first Final Fantasy game I purchased myself, and it was the notion that I hoped my older brother would want to watch me play and maybe have him play it himself, or maybe he would be like, hey, can I play that game? But I don't think that ever happened, as far as I remember. I got over it eventually, and I got lost in the world of Crystal Chronicles. So I got a little sidetracked, but I want to go back to the things that I hated about this game. And honestly, it is much smaller today. Like, what I'm going to be talking about right now is much smaller today than it originally was. I had a lot of, I wouldn't say negative notes, but a lot of things I did not like about this game. I'll talk about that a little bit later. The only thing worthy of hate for me was triggering the final boss of the game. The game did not mention that to anyone, to me or to anyone that was playing this game, that you had to have a certain number of unique memories. Like, you can enter the final dungeon, collect and upgrade your armor, weapons, and magic, but when it came to the final boss, you would see a game over screen every single time. And, I honestly wonder why they would allow the player to go through this dungeon if they couldn't even complete it in the first place. Like, there was no other dungeon in this game that you couldn't go through, that you couldn't complete. This is the only one, and it would have been nice to have some hints at, maybe in order for you to enter this final part, you have to have these number of unique memories. Like, you have to have 25 unique memories or something like that. Unique special memories for you to enter this place, but nope, doesn't tell you. So the only way I found out was through the internet and through my school. I went to school. I think I looked it up at home, but it was on GameFAQs, and the thing would always go, oh snap. So when I went to school, I went to another website, and I was able to find out you had to have a certain number of unique memories, and I found out how to get them. It had to be either every other year, or every year there was some places you can travel to and have a little thing. So yeah, normally I would be complaining about the slow and cumbersome traversal and combat, but I got acclimated to it, and I found that it wasn't the worst thing in the world when it came to Final Fantasy, just this game in general. Now the things I love: the narration from the narrator, the music, the character designs, and to a little small degree the story. The voiceover from the narrator is soothing and inviting, almost like someone is reading a story to a younger person, like their children, or around a lovely campfire to boys, Girl Scouts, or whatever. Just telling a story. Each place, boss, events, and at the end of the year, there's always a little narration. Had their own loving dialogue, making it seem like it was a fantasy world that was fully lived in. There was a lot of things that were going on, and it made me want to play the game even more. It also exuberated something that that you can really, really, really enjoy. I thoroughly enjoy and listen to the soundtrack all the time. Normally in the summer. Not much can be said about the character designs other than they seemed like something out of a Final Fantasy game in a much brighter sense, considering a ton of Final Fantasy games can be quite solemn. They have moments where they're very dark. Other than maybe the final dungeon, I think Final Fantasy Crystal Chronicles was pretty light on its themes, which I actually enjoyed. Another thing I should probably add is although I say it's kind of bright comparing to that, it seemed very soft. It seemed very ASMR compared to other Final Fantasy games, and I think that's what they were going for here, is a very light Final Fantasy game, something you can complete over a small period of time, because it was nice to see some brightness. It was nice to enjoy the Final Fantasy game, not just like in Final Fantasy X, just grinding for hours. This game was just take your time. Eventually you'll get there. If you don't get there, that's okay. There's no sense of urgency. There's no, oh my god, I really have to beat this game. It's just, once you get into a certain number of memories, you go to a campfire, you just have a party with all the people, do it all over again. And I love that. I loved how simple and pleasant it was, and how it can be like that. It was a game about connecting to the world outside of your town, and wanting to see it change and evolve for the better. Each place that you visit, each boss that you fight, each tier, crystal tier that you get from this poisonous change, made it seem all that more relevant. All in all, I love that the first Final Fantasy game I purchased was very fantasy oriented and not a total letdown. I love the changes to the formula and the simplicity and the color of the game. And going back to what I said earlier, where I said I was primarily a little bit more negative, seeing the remaster and reading how that was a total letdown for fans of this game broke my heart. And while I initially was unforgiving of the combat, the restriction to play this game by myself, and the simplicity of the story, I began to look at the journey, and I took then the journey I wanted to take. So the thing that I wanted the most from this game, and eventually was going to get in the remaster, I still have the remaster, I purchased the digital version. I was saddened to hear that it was not up to par. And I know it included voice acting too, I think. So, from other characters and stuff, which I don't think it really needed. So I honestly like that there was, as I said, it was a little more simple, it was a little more bright, a little more soft than the other versions. I began to look at this game a lot differently, but here's hoping that the remaster is much better received now, because I really want to give that one a shot, and I probably will for this video. I probably will try and record a remaster this. If not, it's okay. I still have my OG GameCube copy. I can record off of that. So that's pretty much it for the end of part 1. I've approached the end, and I must say that I've tried to keep it simple and not go off track, and I think I did a good job at that. I think it was fairly simple for each and every one of these Final Fantasy games. And I wanted to end the first part here due to the nature that the next games I was exposed to primarily had me watching the sidelines again. So it's a lot more of me spectating, watching my older brother or other people play these games rather than me playing it myself. It was between this part and part 2 that I began to purchase my own copies of Final Fantasy X and X-2. And I played a little bit more of other games, but it's not at this part and part 2 that Final Fantasy became my favorite franchise. It'll be, I think, maybe in part 3 or part 4 I'll get to that. But it's good to know that this is a good stepping stone for my history with Final Fantasy. But I also wanted to end it here too, because with part 2, it's kind of this is a mirror image, where they're going to be a mirror image of each other, where the first games that I'm exposed to in each part is mainly me spectating, and then by the end I will have purchased and had my own, I was able to play some more Final Fantasy games and actually enjoy them, just like I was with this one. I started with I was exposed to 8, and then I ended with Crystal Chronicles, purchasing Crystal Chronicles and playing them. And then, as I said, between this part 1 and part 2, I purchased 10 and 10-2, and then I would dabble in 8 and 7. So I virtually played all of the games before I got to this part 2. So yeah. So anyways, I appreciate any feedback, and I love that I got to share this story with everyone. It was fun and enjoyable, and I cannot wait until part 2. But enough about me. Let me know what your story is on Final Fantasy or anything game related in the comments, and I will post again next week. Until next video.